Well, first of all, I think pornography should absolutely be made illegal. How that would happen, I wouldn't know. But it seems to me that if something is destroying the fundamental building block of society, namely the family, then for the good of society, we ought to ban that thing. And then I think imprison the pimps who force us to see that kind of rubbish. When I think of pornography, I've written a book on this, by the way. It's called The Porn Myth.
Yeah.
It's a non-religious response to pro-porn arguments. So there's no scripture or teaching from the Bible or anything in it if people are interested. A definition of pornography that I feel somewhat satisfied with is material which depicts erotic behavior that is intended to sexually arouse. I'm not entirely happy with that, but I think it's okay as a working definition. And so because of that, I mean, you can obviously see like a textbook that might display a naked person and that not be pornography. Or you go to the Sistine Chapel and you see breasts and buttocks and testicles, and this isn't pornography. But you can go onto Instagram and this individual has all their clothes on, but I would argue that it is pornographic if it is material which depicts erotic behavior that's intended to sexually arouse. So I think we have to talk to our children at a very young age about pornography. And I think the age of 6 is a good age because it's usually the age that they get some sort of device. Or if you're a good parent who didn't give your children a device for the age of 6, yes, that was a slight low, shame of parents who've done that. Still time to take it and smash it with a hammer, by the way.
Yes,
You're welcome to do that. But you could, a low key shame is what I was trying to say earlier. Yeah. So, but even if you don't give them a device, they usually have access to some device that will access pornography. So, what do you do? How do you talk to children about pornography in a way that doesn't scandalize them or put ideas in their head that they need not have? I think you can do it, actually. I mean, like, we actually talk about all sorts of horrific things to children in age appropriate ways, things that are even worse than pornography. Like, if you go to some public event like a baseball game or a concert, you might say to your child, "Hey, don't run away from dad because there could be a bad man who could take you away from us." Like, that's a horrific thing to say, actually.
It's nightmare fuel.
Yeah, but you don't get into the details because that would be inappropriate as to what you mean and what that might look like. Okay, so if we can do that about abduction and predation, we can do that about pornography. And so here's a way you might do it. You might say, "Hey, buddy, you know how there are good pictures, like photos of mom and dad and the family and, maybe illustrations from your favorite comic book or something? Well, there are also bad pictures, and some bad pictures are called pornography. Pornography is pictures or videos that show parts of our bathing suit, that show part of our body that our bathing suit should cover. And if you ever see this or if someone ever shows it to you, make sure you tell mom and dad. We'd be really proud of you for doing that. You might think you'd be in trouble, but you wouldn't be in trouble. We'd just be really grateful that you told us that because pornography can actually hurt our brains. Just like we always wear a bike helmet when we go on a bike ride because we want to hurt the outside of our head. Well, this thing called pornography it's actually been scientifically shown to damage the inside of our head. So we don't want that for you. So yeah, you should just always tell us and we'd be really proud of you for doing that. All right, so that's like a really, really simplified, basic overview, but it's something anyone can tell their children, and I think it's important that we do that. We don't want to be untwisting the perversion that we've allowed the internet to teach our children about sexuality. What we want to do is teach them the beauty of human sexuality, and when they encounter the perversion, will hopefully therefore see it as such. And we also want our children to know that we love them and they can always come to us if they're struggling with something like this.
It's this how to have self-control and not act on your most basic impulses feels to me like among the definitions of what it means to be an adult.
Mm.
In a perfect sense. We all fail at this. All of us have things that we're tempted by: food, alcohol, playing video games too long when I need to get work done. You name it, there's a temptation that we all fail on. But it does feel to me, and I've thought about that. I'm almost constantly thinking about what is the right way to understand what it means to be an adult. In part because I feel like our culture has abandoned a shared definition of being an adult. that is literally shared such that you don't need to enumerate it, but we all kind of know. We have like the remnants of it in the inverse, in the sense that I think most people, if you ask them, what does it mean to act like a baby? They can rattle it off. Oh yeah, if you throw temper tantrums, if you if you can't control yourself, if you don't have any patience and you need everything right now, like you're kind of acting like a baby. But like when you dig into that, it is like all like social media, the immediacy of what like immediate gratification has come to define 21st century life. And pornography is like the most vicious in a lot of ways examples of it. I don't think I could. My more classical liberal streak recoils at prohibition. It tends to have perverse outcomes, but
yeah, and that's something to take into consideration. In the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas talks about whether or not prostitution should be uh, made illegal, and he quotes Augustine. It's funny. Here's what Aquinas says. I think I disagree with him, but you might agree with him. He quotes Augustine as saying something to the effect of that it shouldn't be made illegal, but it should be quadranted off. Now, his basic point seems to be because by making it illegal, you would actually bring about maybe more intense ills than you otherwise would by permitting it. The kind of the consequences he gives, I don't necessarily agree with, but that's the basic point. And so I think there is merit to that, right? Like, I mean, just because something's just because something's immoral doesn't mean it should be illegal. Like if you were to try to criminalize adultery, say, like how would you go about that in a way that wouldn't actually be a terrifying imposition upon most normal men and women? And you might not be able to do that. I don't think you could do that, which is why it's probably good, I would say, that adultery isn't illegal. And so I'm open to that with pornography, but it just increasingly I'm of the opinion that it is toxic filth that we don't even have a choice to see anymore. It comes looking for us. And because it perverts that action, which unites man and woman and creates families, I do think it should be banned. But I'm open to being corrected or chided about that if you want.
I think it points to something. We could spend another hour having a debate about prohibitionism and whatnot, but I think what it points to instead is something that is maybe a good place as we start to wrap up our time together, and that is, the show's called Dad Saves America, not because I'm always talking about politics, but because I do believe that this is the role that we play as men and as Americans is interconnected. That a healthy masculinity, that fatherhood, that the family, that these are the bedrocks of the West, of a healthy, flourishing society, whether it's West or East, and that faith is a big part of that. But in the American tradition, which I would say this might no longer be technically true, but we have been and maybe still are the freest country in the world in terms of legal protection for the individual to choose their own path, to do, say, consume, create whatever we want, so long as we don't hurt anybody else. One definition of sort of a kind of libertarian ethos is you're allowed to do anything peaceful or anything that doesn't hurt others. And I think that the founders, we have to some degree lost, I think, an assumption that the founders all had, which was that freedom only worked in the service of human flourishing for a moral people, for a people who didn't need to have their morality legislated, because you would be ashamed to go into the nudie bar. Yes, it's over in that part of the neighborhood. And, if you're a pillar of the community and you're seen going there, it's bad for you, and it's bad for you. And yes, and so you don't. And so like freedom and non-coercive or less coercive, let's say, forms of judgment, including the judgment of your church, the judgment of the laws of Moses, were there. They were operational. If you just had I can do whatever I want, and so long as I'm not physically hurting you, you shall not pass judgment on me. I don't think any of the founders, I know this, the founders would have said, our system of government can't constrain that society. That society will fall like Babylon. How do you think about that? How do you think about the relationship between sort of what we call civilization and the moral norms that are the focus of this conversation and of the teachings of Christianity, and not just Christianity, but obviously as Christians and as Catholics, that's our worldview. How do you think about those two things and the feedback loop they're in together?
Yeah, great points. Yeah, I think freedom we often think of in the negative sense. Like things shouldn't infringe upon my rights. I shouldn't be forced to do what I don't want to do. And fair enough. There's a lot to be said about that. But we often don't think of it in its positive sense. Like I remember Archbishop Fulton Sheen making this joke. He said, you don't go out onto the street in New York City, see a cab driver and say, are you free? And when he says yes, you say, hooray for freedom. It doesn't make any sense. Like freedom exists for something. It's not just about what's not being done. It's about what ought to be done. So St. John Paul II said that freedom exists for the sake of love, not for the sake of making ourselves worse.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.